know who this is?
Morpheus.
Yes. I've been looking for you, Neo. I don't know if you're ready to see what I want to show you, but unfortunately you and I have run out of time.
Need for far greater public information, and second, to the need for far greater official secrecy. The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. But I do ask every publisher, every editor, and every newsman in the nation to re-examine his own standards and to recognize the nature of our country's peril. In time of war, the government and the press have customarily joined in an effort based largely on self-discipline to prevent unauthorized disclosures to the enemy. In times of clear and present danger, the courts have held that even the privileged rights of the First Amendment must yield to the public's need for national security. Today, no war has been declared, and however fierce the struggle may be, it may never be declared in the traditional fashion. Our way of life is under attack. Those who make themselves our enemy are advancing around the globe. The survival of our friends is in danger, and yet no war has been declared. No borders have been crossed by marching troops. No missiles have been fired. If the press is awaiting a declaration of war before it imposes the self-discipline of combat conditions, then I can only say that no war ever posed a greater threat to our security. If you are awaiting a finding of clear and present danger, then I can only say that the danger has never been more clear, and its presence has never been more imminent. It requires a change in outlook, a change in tactics, a change in missions by the government, by the people, by every businessman or labor leader, and by every newspaper. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. It conducts the Cold War, in short, with a wartime discipline no democracy would ever hope or wish to match.
Edward George Ruddy died today. Edward George Ruddy was the chairman of the board of the Union Broadcasting Systems, and he died at 11 o'clock this morning of a heart condition, and woe is us. We're in a lot of trouble. So, a rich little man with white hair died. What has that got to do with the price of rice, right? And why is that woe to us? Because you people and 62 million other Americans are listening to me right now. Because less than 3% of you people read books. Because less than 15% of you read newspapers. Because the only truth you know is what you get over this tube. Right now, there is an entire generation that never knew anything that didn't come out of this tube. This tube is the gospel, the ultimate revelation. This tube can make or break presidents, popes, prime ministers. This tube is the most awesome goddamn force in the whole godless world. And woe is us if it ever falls into the hands of the wrong people. And that's why woe is us that Edward George Ruddy died. Because this company is now in the hands of CCA, the Communication Corporation of America. There's a new chairman of the board, a man called Frank Hackett, sitting in Mr. Ruddy's office on the 20th floor. And when the 12th largest company in the world controls the most awesome goddamn propaganda force in the whole godless world, who knows what shit will be peddled for truth on this network? So you listen to me. Listen to me. Television is not the truth. Television is a goddamn amusement park. Television is a circus, a carnival, a traveling troupe of acrobats, storytellers, dancers, singers, jugglers, sideshow freaks, lion tamers, and football players. We're in the boredom-killing business. So if you want the truth, go to God. Go to your gurus. Go to yourselves. Because that's the only place you're ever going to find any real truth. But man, you're never going to get any truth from us. We'll tell you anything you want to hear. We lie like hell. We'll tell you that Kojak always gets the killer and that nobody ever gets cancer in Archie Bunker's house. And no matter how much trouble the hero is in, don't worry, just look at your watch. At the end of the hour, he's going to win. We'll tell you any shit you want to hear. We deal in illusions, man. None of it is true. But you people sit there day after day, night after night, all ages, colors, creeds. We're all you know. You're beginning to believe the illusions we're spinning here. You're beginning to think that the tube is reality and that your own lives are unreal. You do whatever the tube tells you. You dress like the tube. You eat like the tube. You raise your children like the tube. You even think like the tube. This is mass madness, you maniacs. In God's name, you people are the real thing. We are the illusion. So turn off your television sets. Turn them off now. Turn them off right now. Turn them off and leave them off. Turn them off right in the middle of the sentence I'm speaking to you now. Turn them off.
But the truth is that almost every avenue from which we get our information in the mainstream media is controlled by only 6 corporations that have one specific interest: profit. News censorship is happening every day, but not necessarily from the top down blacking out the stories, but also in the form of self-censorship, framing, backpaging, all to protect the interests of those corporate conglomerates. So who are the big 6 corporations that control nearly everything you see, hear, and read? First, there's Comcast, formerly owned by GE, which controls MSNBC, NBC, and Telemundo. And there's Disney, which owns ABC, the History Channel, and and ESPN. Next, Viacom, the parent company of MTV, Paramount, and BET. And CBS with all its affiliates. And there's News Corp, which owns Fox News, the New York Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And finally, Time Warner, the parent company of CNN, Time, and People magazine, as well as Warner Brothers. So what impact does it have when an agency that's supposed to serve as a watchdog for the powerful becomes a lapdog for the powerful? Fox News was going to air a story on the bovine growth hormone, BGH, bovine growth hormone, of course, another Monsanto case of censorship where they were invested in Monsanto for advertising, and their boss said no when a team of Fox investigative reporters wanted to cover this story. Monsanto threatened the station, sent them a letter saying there will be dire consequences, this is a direct quote, dire consequences for Fox News if the story is aired, and I wanted to play what happened when they confronted their boss about this.
I said, you know, this is news. This is important. This is stuff people need to know. And I'll never forget, he didn't pause a beat, and he said, we just paid $3 billion for these television stations. We'll tell you what the news is. The news is what we say it is.
It's played. They actually countersued against Fox under Florida's whistleblower statute. And as it turns out, under Florida law, they lost that lawsuit because turns out it's not illegal to falsify the news. One of those examples back in 1998, kind of a very clear-cut example. ABC was 2020, they were going to air this story about how Disneyland is actually hiring pedophiles. I mean, it's just a crazy story. You're thinking a theme park for kids and pedophiles just sounds terrible. They weren't able to pull the story. Why? Because Disney owns ABC. It's very clear-cut. You don't want to endanger or make the corporate interests look bad. So, I mean, that's one of those clear-cut stories. But, I mean, it also raises questions. That one's relatively easy, not to downplay pedophiles. But when you look at cases like CNN's running a story about the BP oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon spill, about the cleanup efforts and how, things are getting better. And as soon as the segment's over, you see a commercial come on, and it's BP. And it's BP representatives going, come down to the coast and eat some one-eyed shrimp or whatever they're doing. I mean, there's a problem in there. And it's so obvious. But I think people don't realize it as much as it's in your face.
They don't realize it, but Project Censored, one of the greatest research organizations in the country about censorship in the media, did a study where they found that 118 people only sit on 288 corporate boards that unify kind of this media conglomerate and corporate America. So you have people involved in Kraft Foods, Monsanto, so many different things, defense corporations, the pharmaceutical industry, lobbying together, all sitting on these boards, and it really is such a small amount of people really controlling all these things from the top down.
It's 6
What
corporations.
are some of the most shocking things that you found in terms of just conflicts of interest?
For example, NBC, Citigroup, Exxon, Philip Morris. Their execs sit on board of directors for Philip Morris. Mm-hmm. That's not okay. CBS has board members sitting in Walmart, General Dynamics. These are drone manufacturers. The execs for CBS are the same guys that are sitting in the board of directors for drone manufacturers?
And I think
how is that okay?
And I think when people think of the corporate media, they're like, oh, well, of course, the corporate media. But really, we're talking about NPR and PBS as well. I mean, NPR was running a story during the BP oil spill featuring a scientist that was talking about how oil was in the Gulf that would bacteria that would eat the oil. It was like, well, this bacteria is just going to clean up the oil itself. We don't have to worry about anything. Turns out later, according to Greg Powell, the scientist interviewed about the story was given $500 million, $500 million
exactly.
From BP. NPR never mentioned this detail, this quaint detail, when they were doing the story. And of course, we saw PBS.
The thing about that, the money that, so you've got all these universities, all these independent researchers all over the country doing research on oil biology, and they're all being funded by BP.
And PBS aired the drone documentary by Lockheed Martin, pretty much a promo for drones. And us talking about all of this really calls into question. The U.S. State Department issued a warning about restricted press freedom in the rest of the world, meanwhile ignoring that the consolidation of 90% of the U.S. media by 6 corporations. I mean, really, we're ranked 32 in the world in press freedom.
The year is 1917, and Representative Oscar Callaway enters a disturbing statement into the U.S. congressional record. The statement reveals why J.P. Morgan interests hired 12 high-ranking news managers. The 12 were asked to determine the most influential newspapers in America. They were to figure out how many news organizations it would take to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. The 12 found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought, and an editor was placed at each paper to ensure that all published information was in keeping with the new policy. Soon, that policy would be defined by a front group formed by J.P. Morgan and his colleagues. In fact, Morgan's personal attorney was founding president of the organization, the Council on Foreign Relations. Today, the CFR maintains that its goal is to increase America's understanding of the world. However, the actual objective of this highly exclusive club is revealed by the rare admissions of the insiders themselves. In the early 60s, a Georgetown University professor collects information for a book favorable to the network of powerful men who founded the CFR. For 2 years, Professor Carroll Quigley is allowed to examine the confidential papers and secret records of this network. Quigley reveals that these men aim to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. In short, they seek total and quiet control of the entire world. And the CFR is their most visible conduit for carrying out that agenda. CFR members include America's wealthiest tycoons, as well as the highly placed elite in government, academic institutions, tax-exempt foundations, and the establishment media. Ruling Class Journalists, written by Richard Harwood, describes the CFR membership as the ruling establishment in the United States. The Washington Post article boasted that news reporters who are CFR members do not merely analyze and interpret foreign policy for the United States, they help make it. Who are these policymakers? Many of their faces are familiar. NBC's Tom Brokaw, CBS's Dan Rather, ABC's Barbara Walters, Jim Lehrer of PBS, William F. Buckley of National Review, media mogul Rupert Murdoch, owner of the giant multifaceted News Corporation. These media heavyweights, and many others like them, are members of the CFR. Powerful corporations are also invited to become members. At the close of the 20th century, CFR influence presided over far-reaching consolidations of media control. In 1995, CFR members Michael Eisner of Disney and ABC's Thomas Murphy merged their media empires. Soon after the merger, the Disney-ABC empire becomes a CFR corporate member. In the year 2000, the world's largest internet service provider, America Online, joins forces with Time Warner, one of the world's largest news organizations. The CEOs favoring the move are CNN's Thomas Johnson and Time Warner's Gerald Levin, both CFR members. Once again, another media giant is created under the shadow of CFR influence. Today, an elite handful of individuals define the agendas that are supported by the empire of establishment news.
In consumer news, economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some of the spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take the spring out of the step of the Easter Bunny.
Where are all these news stations getting their scripts from? Well, there are affiliate news services that supply packages and scripts to hundreds of stations around the country. Stations then have their anchors read the canned story with the generic script. Now, you might look at this and say it's just indicative of how lazy local news can be. But consider the implications of this kind of reporting for 1 second. Say it wasn't an Easter bunny, and rather the story being mindlessly regurgitated was about a virus, a terrorist attack, or a report on war casualty counts. The bottom line is that people who watch the news tend to trust this information. information that then influences their perception and decisions. So for these anchors to ask no questions, do no fact-checking, and hold no different interpretation of the news they're delivering is not only absurd, it's downright dangerous.
The bottom line is that the government is getting what they have ordered. They do not want your children to be educated. They do not want you to think too much. That is why our country and our world has become so proliferated with entertainments, mass media, television shows, amusement parks, drugs, alcohol, and every kind of entertainment to keep the human mind entertained so that you don't get in the way of important people by doing too much thinking. You had better wake up and understand that there are people who are guiding your life and you don't even know it.
Television is the most powerful weapon of psychological warfare in history. The programming that we are constantly assaulted by throughout our life conditions us, it programs us to a particular worldview. Now, we may consider it normal because we were born into this system of lies and deception, and because we were born into this situation and our parents were born into it and have suffered from it, we don't know any better.
What I may call the messages of Brave New World, but it is possible to make people contented with their servitude. I think this can be done. I think it has been done in the past, but I think it could be done even more effectively now, because you can provide them with bread and circuses, and you can provide them with endless amounts of distractions and propaganda.
We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!
They are dismantling the sleeping middle class. More and more people are becoming poor. We are their cattle. We are being bred for slavery. The revolution.
Not again.
We cannot break their signal. Our transmitter is not powerful enough. The signal must be shut off at the source. We have...
The growing list of companies that are exporting American jobs to cheap foreign labor markets are not doing it by themselves. There is now a growing multi-billion-dollar industry that's helping these companies send American work overseas. Bill Tucker reports.
The list of companies which outsource and offshore work is a long one and filled with some impressive names. And the type of work being offshored has gone way beyond call centers.
Once a company decides to outsource, they're predicating their decision based on price. So the natural inclination is to go with the lowest cost provider. That segues right into offshoring.
All made possible by the internet, developed by Americans. U.S. businesses spent $16 billion on offshoring work last year, according to Gartner, and India gets the lion's share of that work. Some of the biggest names in the field are Infosys, Tata Industries, Wipro. Consultants often play a role as the middleman connecting companies with offshore providers, holding conferences to help companies outsource and offshore work. It's a large and fast-growing business. Conferences are heavily attended and often protested by workers displaced by outsourcing. One consultant makes a simple point. If we don't like the offshoring trend, we have no one to blame but ourselves.
As customers, we demand the lowest possible price and the highest quality on our products and services. As shareholders, every time we open up our 401k statement, we're looking at the returns from our investments. And so the pressure on businesses to constantly improve their operations is relentless.
But not every company that outsources offshores. Case in point, Healthcare Management Resources, which handles billing and patient account services for 90 hospitals around the country.
Outsourcing domestic has a tremendous advantage. The best situation is to have local people that understand the culture, understand customs, and can effectively deal with the problems that arise.
HMR currently operates 2 call centers in Tennessee and employs 425 people.
One industry observer at Gartner warns that the jobs that are being lost to offshore are not cyclical. They are not likely to ever be coming back. Luke.
My name is Robert Reich. I was Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton. Before that, the Carter administration. Before that, I was a special aide to Abraham Lincoln. Of all developed nations, the United States has the most unequal distribution of income, and we're surging toward even greater inequality. 1928 and 2007 become the peak years for income concentration. It looks like a suspension bridge.
Last year we made $36,000.
I probably make $50,000 a year, working 70 hours a week.
The middle class is struggling. People occasionally say to me, what nation does it better? The answer is the United States. In the decades after World War II, the economy boomed, but you had very low inequality.
Do you know Robert Reich?
I do indeed.
He's a communist. When I was a kid, bigger boys would pick on me. I think it changed my life. I had to protect people from the people who would beat them up economically. Who is actually looking out for the American worker? The answer is nobody. If workers don't have power, if they don't have a voice, their wages and benefits start eroding. We are losing equal opportunity in America. Any one of you who feels cynical, just consider where we have been.
To get to this point, let's start from the beginning. 1913, the U.S. Federal Reserve was created as well as a permanent income tax. 1917, U.S. enters World War I. 1929, the beginning of the Great Depression. By 1932, we saw an estimated 23.6% unemployment. 1933 to 1936, the New Deal. Economic programs are enacted under President Franklin Roosevelt, including the Social Security Act of 1935. The U.S. remains in a depression up until 1941 when the U.S. enters World War II. 1945, the end of World War II, and the U.S. economy booms. The middle class grows tremendously and gives birth to what we now call the baby boomers. 1971, the U.S. has taken off the gold standard. The Federal Reserve notes are no longer redeemable for gold. 1973 and 1979, we saw 2 energy shocks. An early 1980s recession sees the unemployment rate peak during the end of 1982 at 10.8%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Over this time period, the manufacturing share of non-farm employment has gone from 30% in 1950 to only 10% today. More efficient technology, including computers, automation, and increased worldwide competition are a few factors helping to decrease the U.S. manufacturing base. Then there's the notorious NAFTA, which came into effect January 1st, 1994. Exactly 1 year later, the U.S. joined the World Trade Organization. Maybe Ross Perot was right back in 1992.
We have got to stop sending jobs overseas. You can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for labor, have no health care, that's the most expensive single element making a car, have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, and no retirement, and you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south.
Our jobs are being sucked to other countries in the world, a large portion to China. In 2010, CNN Money reported that China's factories were close to reaching U.S. manufacturing output. The effect of these trade agreements, as well as the general trend, helped the welfare state to balloon and the middle class to shrink. Since 1975, practically all the gains in household income have gone to the top 20% of households. Huge corporations are getting richer while small and medium businesses are closing. Wall Street is booming while Main Street is suffering. Excessive business regulations have stopped many businesses, in the same token, jobs from being created where they would have been. This video from the Institute for Justice puts it well.
Just about everyone knows that government at every level is requiring more and more Americans to get a government-issued license before they can earn an honest living. In the 1950s, well, only about 1 in 20 Americans needed the government's blessing to do their job. Today, that number is more than 1 in 3, and government puts all kinds of requirements on would-be entrepreneurs, making it harder for these entrepreneurs to start and grow small businesses.
We cannot keep increasing regulations, paying for health care, adding more taxes and fees, and still expect the U.S. to grow jobs when there are countries near and far with less regulations and costs, making great incentives for businesses to start there instead of here. America is on the brink of a collapse.
I just can't handle it anymore.
It is approaching the end of its time to fix it before it does collapse. Currently, in order to maintain the same unemployment rate in 2011, 150,000 jobs need to be created each month just to keep up with population growth. We need to stop government spending, stop wars of aggression costing us hundreds of billions a year, end the Federal Reserve and abolish the income tax, and reduce business regulations across all states and federally. Without taking these steps, short of a miracle, America doesn't stand a chance.
Gathers momentum across the globe. The anger at corporate America continues to grow day by day. And for more on this, let's talk to Curtis Ellis, the executive director at the American Jobs Alliance. Mr. Ellis, has there been any indication that the White House is going to listen to the Occupy Wall Street protesters and take action against the big banks?
No. The White House is paying lip service to the concerns of the protesters and the unemployed, but we see exactly the opposite in the way of action. They just got finished pushing 3 more outsourcing deals under the false name of trade deals, which will actually benefit the financial sector, but lead to the more outsourcing of more U.S. jobs in manufacturing and other sectors. And we also just saw yesterday that the U.S. Justice Department made a settlement with Citibank. Citibank defrauded investors in the collapse of the mortgage industry, but there were no criminal charges brought. Citibank paid $250 million, but they got a slap on the wrist for a fine, and no one went to jail. This is not taking action against the big banks.
Okay, and we just...
Wall Street not only did not create jobs, they are directly responsible for the unemployment crisis in America. I like to say that Wall Street bankers are like the child who kills his parents and then pleads for mercy from the judge because he's an orphan. The Wall Street bankers actively pushed corporations to outsource jobs and move production from America to third world countries and to China. They counseled corporations, they told corporations, cut costs by cutting your U.S. payroll, and then move those jobs to China, to Vietnam, to Indonesia, to all of these countries where they can pay pennies on the dollar. This will look like you're a cost cutter. It'll boost the stock price, and it'll make your quarterly earnings report look good. Now, the CEOs were being paid in company stock, so they were eager to boost the share price by any means necessary. What they did is they destroyed the American economy, they destroyed the dreams of American workers by taking their jobs away, but at the same time, they were destroying the customers who bought from companies, the taxpayers who pay taxes into the U.S. Treasury, and they were destroying the incomes of homeowners who could no longer pay their mortgages, and hence we got a mortgage crisis. So the Wall Street companies are directly responsible for this unemployment crisis. They have not only not created jobs, they are responsible for destroying jobs in the United States, and that's what the protesters are really protesting about. They have no jobs. If they had jobs, there would be no financial crisis, and there would be no protester.
President Obama is constantly talking about the need to create green jobs to solve unemployment and help the environment. And Congress approved a bill that includes a nearly $2 billion stimulus for green programs. But John Carl followed the trail to watch out for your money and found jobs all right. But how could it be? A lot of them going overseas, even about to go to China.
It's a stimulus wind power boom. Over the past year, building enough new wind farms like this to power 2.4 million homes.
Each one of these turbines costs about $3 million, and they are enormous, about as tall as a 40-story building.
Nearly $2 billion stimulus dollars have been spent to build these things. The problem? Most of them have been built overseas, the jobs outside the United States.
This is a breakdown of the different countries that have companies that have gotten money.
Russ Choma with the Investigative Reporting Workshop has crunched the numbers. Nearly 8 out of every 10 stimulus dollars for wind power have gone to foreign companies.
Most of the jobs are going overseas.
Senator Chuck Schumer says this is not the way it was meant to be. Stimulus dollars were intended to create jobs here in the United States.
This is one of these stories in Washington that when you tell people 5 miles outside the Beltway and everywhere else in America, they just cannot believe it. Makes people lose faith in government, and it frankly infuriates me.
But Congress may be to blame. The way the law is written, projects get money regardless of where the equipment is made. Senator Schumer wants that changed, but the administration refuses to acknowledge there's a problem.
Is there anything in the Recovery Act that requires these machines to be built here in the United States?
Those historically haven't had Buy American provisions, and they don't under the Recovery Act either.
That's a bitter pill for the nearly 100 workers at this Pennsylvania blade factory who were temporarily laid off before Thanksgiving and are only now beginning to be called back to work.
When we're employing other countries, we can't feed our kids at home. It gets hard, you know.
And now a Chinese company called A-Power is helping build a massive wind farm in West Texas that expects to get $450 million stimulus dollars.
It's West Texas wind and a lot of American tax dollars, but the turbines for the new projects and most of the jobs will come from China.
Walt Hornaday, an American partner on the project, says there will be some American jobs.
Our estimation is that we're going to have on the order of 300 construction jobs just within the fence of the project.
That's 300 jobs in Texas, but about 2,000 manufacturing jobs in China. Jonathan Carl, ABC News, Wildorado, Texas.
The destruction of America's middle class is not something we discuss lightly. This is an accelerating trend, one that touches all of our lives directly, no matter what income category you're in, educational background, or political affiliation. This trend will alter your own job, business, and everyone around you. 76% of Americans right now are living paycheck to paycheck, according to the new survey by Bankrate.com. According to the same survey, 27% of Americans have no savings at all. This survey confirms the shocking CashNet USA survey from last month that found 46% of Americans have less than $800 in savings. Food stamps are the modern-day breadline, and since 2000 they have risen dramatically. Sadly, 2013 is now approaching 50 million Americans. That is 1 in 6 Americans receiving government aid in order to eat, and almost 50% of them have jobs. This is an important note because the jobs that are being created are low-paying jobs. We lost good jobs in 2008, and we are replacing them with temporary, low-paying positions. Most know by now that Walmart is the largest employer, but did you know that the second largest employer in the U.S. is Kelly Services, a temporary work provider, aka a temp agency? The latest jobs numbers are showing part-time employment to be at an all-time high, while full-time jobs are actually decreasing. For June 2013, we lost 240,000 full-time jobs from the official employment numbers. For those of you that think a political fix, like a new president, would put us right back on track, you are dead wrong. There are about 25 million people who are either unemployed or underemployed. This does not include adults in college who will inevitably be looking for work. During the 1990s boom, when we had a wave of baby boomers peaking in their spending habits and communications revolution with the internet, that decade saw roughly 22 million jobs created. This means that even if you have a repeat of the 1990s, you couldn't absorb all the people who need jobs today. We live in a failed fiscal state. The United States situation is chronic. All of this talk about austerity or stimulus is nonsense. It's over. There is no fixing this mess. We are looking at either a planned reset or a reset that will arise from the ashes of an economic disaster. The U.S. annual deficit is so bad that even if we cut out all government except entitlements, we would still run a deficit. Cut the military, all U.S. federal workers, even Congress, and you are still in the red. The U.S. debt is now growing exponentially, increasing $10 trillion in the past 10 years. Compare that to the entire world where debt has only doubled in the past 10 years to $190 trillion. I know it's still bad, but it's like OMG bad when you look at the U.S. We are now in a situation where the global economies depend on an unsustainable amount of debt. For example, think of all the federal workers and federal programs that we have to borrow money for in order to keep them funded. Well, if you lay out those federal workers or end these federal programs, what do you think will happen to the fraudulent economy? We are not advocating to keep the fraud going. We're just pointing out that we are so deep into the fraud now that the fraud has become normal. So when it all ends, it is going to end badly. Every business will be affected. Our economy has ballooned itself off of endless borrowing. Our plan of action, income and education. This is how you will survive and prosper over the next 20 years as the middle class is destroyed. This is your future we are talking about. You need to be ahead of the curve. Find ways to create multiple sources of income. Real estate rental income, a new business, day trading, online sales, or strategic investments. Starting something yourself now while we still have some normalcy will give you the experience you will need when times are tough. Increasing your education in business, trade, real estate, and how to invest. Financial education will help you get through the financial mess. Please do not waste your time or money on getting another degree. When we hear people talking about going back to school, we cringe, especially if they are over 30 years old. Come on, get on with it already. No need to kill your limited free time on Earth in some classroom with an instructor teaching you out of a book. If you want to learn, go partner with someone who is doing what you want to do. Learn from them directly. Work for free or at a discounted rate to get educated. But don't get into debt for some piece of paper. Being self-aware of this systemic problem already gives you an edge. Now you just need to really think about how this will affect your life. Some simple words of advice. Pay off debt and limit your liabilities. If you have to sell your house and buy a smaller, cheaper one that you can pay off, do it. Don't have an auto loan. Seriously, it is just a vehicle. Don't slave away or take unnecessary funds for a vehicle when you could be investing in a business that will make you financially free. Get rid of any unnecessary payments in your life. The middle class is one crisis away from broke. The destruction of the middle class thus far has been slow, but we are now at the point where it will happen almost overnight. Remember, 76% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, and nearly 50% have less than $800 in their savings account. Things are about to change in the USA.
From the time an American child reaches the 6th grade, they are taught that the key to success in life is to do well in high school so that they can get accepted to the best possible college. The better grades they get in high school, the better college they will have an opportunity to get into. They are taught that if they get into a great college and get their college degree, any type of job they desire in the field of their choice will be there waiting for them. After getting their dream job, they will be able to buy any car and house they desire, start their own family, and live the American dream. Most Americans today have an expectation of future economic success simply by obtaining a college degree. The entire purpose of elementary school is to prepare students for high school, and the entire purpose of high school is to prepare students for college. In fact, the U.S. now has hundreds of private college preparatory high schools that, at a cost of $25,000 per year, are supposed to increase students' chances of getting into a top-tier college. Students are taught to believe that if they don't go to college, they will be on a path to nowhere and will have no chance of ever building a successful career. Government regulations like No Child Left Behind have left grade and high schools in shambles. Instead of teachers having the freedom to think outside the box and use creative techniques to prepare their students for the real world, they are forced to be narrow-minded and teach with worthless information that will never help their students have successful careers. Today, there are no high schools left in America that teach students the knowledge necessary to start their own business, invent their own product, or even how to use the internet and other free resources to become educated about things without attending college. The annual cost to attend the average private four-year college in America today is $27,293, up 29% from 5 years ago, during the 2005-2006 school year, when the annual tuition cost $21,235. This does not include the cost of textbooks, which have tripled over the past decade. Colleges are now charging $200 for each single textbook that has no resale value because they put out new, slightly revised versions with a new name each year. The textbook publishers are even colluding with college bookstores to make custom textbooks so that students can't save money by buying them online. Colleges are getting kickbacks from publishers in order to destroy the used textbook market, which by itself is proof enough that college administrators are only interested in lining their own pockets and have no interest in helping their students.
You have to have a certain kind of brain to understand the dead language that they write in textbooks. But they brainwash you from a little kid up so that you buy into the system. And you get good grades, and you study hard, and then you become a member of the total system. No freedom. You don't know how to think, because they told you how to think their way.
College tuition has seen 5.15% annual price inflation over the past 5 years. This is despite the fact that U.S. real estate prices are down 26% from their peak in July of 2006. And the Dow Jones is down 18% from its peak in October of 2007. Even oil is down 38% from its peak in July of 2008. During the financial crisis of 2008, Americans lost $10.2 trillion in paper wealth. And college is the only thing in America, besides the cost of health care, that did not at least temporarily decline in price.
Inflation has made it impossible. Again, when I was a kid, it wasn't, you never heard parents saying, we're planning and putting money away for your education because it's going to cost us $100,000 and we have to keep putting that money away so that when you graduate, not only will you not pay us back, you're not even going to get a job.
Over just a 2-year period from December of 2007 through December of 2009, 8,363,000 jobs in America were lost, or 6.1% of total jobs. 1 year later, in December of 2010, thanks to the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government spending $4.6 trillion on bailouts, stimulus programs, and other government spending, 1.124 million jobs in America, or 0.9% of total jobs, have been recovered. That is over $4 million spent for each job created.
As we move deeper into this great recession that we believe, as inflation continues to skyrocket, the reality of a Great Depression will come in, because people will realize that all that worthless money you have can't buy you much of anything. You're going to see more and more people, as they're already doing it, believing that by going to college, that's going to be their passport to the future. It's not what it used to be. A degree, a college degree, a BS, what does that buy you? And I love the mentality. The mentality is this, that corporations and businesses won't hire a person unless they get a degree. Not me. I don't care if you have a degree. It makes absolutely no difference. I want you to have a mind, be able to think for yourself and think on your feet, and be energetic and love what you're doing and have a passion in so many different other ways. Not to be able to just regurgitate what you're being told. And that's all it's come to. It's regurgitation.
During an economic downturn, when Americans are losing their jobs, their primary instinct is to seek higher education in order to make themselves more attractive to potential employers and better position themselves to receive a job. However, how are Americans supposed to spend $27,293 per year for college when they have no savings or income to pay for it? The U.S. government, with the backing of the Federal Reserve, in the same way they created the real estate bubble by providing mortgages to all Americans through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, regardless of whether or not they had any capacity to pay the loans back, has been using the exact same easy lending practices to create one of the largest bubbles in U.S. history, the college bubble. College students borrowed $106 billion in total student loans for the 2009-2010 school year, up from $96 billion in 2008-2009, $94 billion in 2007-2008, $87 billion in 2006-2007, and $83 billion in 2005-2006. Total student loan debt in the U.S. currently stands at $830 billion and now exceeds credit card debt.
Dollars more on average than those without a degree.
Graduates from four-year colleges earn nearly an estimated $1 million more.
Most colleges and universities in America use this $1 million in additional income statistic to hype and sell their product. It has been repeated so many times that it's just about been accepted by all, with nobody questioning its validity. However, for any student thinking of attending college, they need to consider the facts surrounding this number and compare it to the true cost of attending college. With the cost of annual college tuition now at $27,293, if we assume continued 5.15% college tuition inflation over the next 4 years, the average cost for a student entering college now to receive their bachelor's degree in 4 years will be $117,900. Therefore, even with the current college inflation crisis, an expenditure of $117,900 on the surface seems like a good investment if the return will be $1 million. The secret truth is, most college students do not receive their degree in 4 years. The Americans who are earning $1 million more in their lifetimes are actually spending an average of 6 years in college before receiving their degrees. Therefore, assuming continued 5.15% college tuition inflation for years 5 and 6, the total cost for the average student's degree in order to earn their $1 million in extra income will be $186,349. For those who borrow that full amount and pay it back over 10 years at a 6% interest rate, the additional interest expense would be $61,914, bringing the total cost of the degree up to $248,263. Then you need to consider the matter of lost income. The average high school graduate who finds an entry-level job without a college degree earns $35,400 per year over the first 6 years. For the majority of college students who don't have jobs, they are losing $212,400 in income over their 6 years in college. combining the expected cost to attend college for 6 years with potential interest expenses and lost income, and now we are at a total cost of $460,663, all for the hope of earning an extra $1 million over a lifetime.
California Senator Dianne Feinstein worked for more than a year to get the assault weapons bill passed in the face of ferocious opposition from the National Rifle Association. She says she got the best she could.
If I could have gotten 51 votes in the Senate of the United States for an outright ban, picking up every one of them, Mr. and Mrs. America, turn them all in, I would have done it. I could not do that. The votes weren't here.
What is a right? You know you're dealing with a fundamental concept when it's difficult to define a word without using one of its synonyms. The strange thing about rights is that though we usually think of them in a positive sense, in reality, rights are comprised of boundaries. Freedom of speech, for example, cannot exist unless boundaries are established which prevent those in power from murdering or imprisoning those who speak out against them. But who is ultimately responsible for upholding those boundaries? You might think that you have the right to your beliefs and to speak your mind. But what happens to those rights when a gang of armed men start moving from house to house, killing or kidnapping those that hold beliefs that they don't agree with? This is a scenario that's unfolded over and over again throughout history. It keeps repeating, not because history has been forgotten, but rather because it hasn't been properly understood. That which we most need to understand often hides behind questions that we don't want to answer. Do those who are being attacked have the right to defend themselves? Do they have the right to the means to defend themselves? Or should they just put their faith in the government? There are those who believe that the government should have the monopoly on violence, that the government should be the only one armed, and that we should trust the government to protect us. There's just one little tiny problem with that position. The gang of armed men doing the killing and the kidnapping usually is the government. It's the governments of the world who have initiated the genocides, the ethnic cleansings, the great mass murders. It's the governments who have systematically exterminated political dissidents. It's the governments who have built the concentration camps and the secret prisons. It's the governments who have always been behind the worst crimes committed against humanity. Human governments have repeatedly demonstrated themselves to be the most bloodthirsty, ruthless, and corrupt organizations on this planet. Even the sickest serial killers have nothing on the state. And yet some would entrust them with the absolute power of life and death over you and your family. That's what's at stake when you give the government the monopoly on violence. Because when the people have no means of defense, the government has no boundaries. Some would sidestep this issue by asserting that what we need is a stronger United Nations, a global government that's capable of keeping the rest of the world in line. But this just underscores a deep misconception. Government attracts tyrants, petty dictators, bullies, and psychopaths like manure draws flies. It always has, and it always will. And the more power associated with the position, the greater the attraction. Government attracts these types of individuals because it gives them an opportunity to exert power over other people. And for icing on the cake, they get a paycheck. What more could a psychopath ask for? Global government is the ultimate power. The power to run the world. You can rest assured that the crazies will find their way in. And sooner or later, they'll be running it. Then who will protect you? Then who will you turn to? You can't resolve this issue by creating bigger and bigger governmental bodies. You can't buy safety by giving more and more of your power and rights away. The root of the issue is the monopoly on violence. And the solution is simple. No one should be given the monopoly on violence. Humans simply aren't mature enough to deal with that kind of temptation. The counterbalance must be maintained. And the right to self-defense is that counterbalance. The right to defense is the boundary which makes all of the rights possible. And it's not just a right, it's a responsibility. We are responsible for protecting our families and our communities, and we don't eliminate that responsibility when we hand it over to someone else. But the right to defense is meaningless without the means of defense. Therefore, the right to own and carry the means of defense is a core human right. As bitter of a pill as that might be for some people, what you need to realize is that if you allow that right to be taken from you when you don't need it, it won't be there when you do.
It looks like a gamer's dream, but this is actually the UK's drone nerve centre. Military chiefs have finally allowed cameras into the facility in Lincolnshire, giving us a glimpse of how pilots operate the RAF's unmanned aircraft. The footage was filmed during a visit by Defence Secretary Philip Hammond.
They provide a huge additional capability to support our operations on the ground, huge additional protection for our troops on the ground, and I think they're going to be a feature of future operations in whatever theatre we find ourselves.
The Air Force started flying drones over Afghanistan from RAF Waddington in 2013. Previously, they operated them from Afghanistan or the US. The use of drones, especially those that can fire missiles called Reapers, is controversial.
There seems to be a cross-country agreement, an agreement that is kept hidden, and yet most in Washington and Pakistan, at least, know all about it. I'm talking about drone strikes in Pakistan. U.S. leaders don't speak much about it, citing security reasons, and Pakistan, while simultaneously condemning the strikes, still allow them to happen for the most part. Now, drone strikes target al-Qaeda and Taliban militants living in some of these tribal areas along the Afghan border. But for the first time, President Obama just admitted it's not only the bad guys who are getting killed.
I want to make sure that people understand actually drones have not caused a huge number of civilian casualties. For the most part, they have been very precise, precision strikes against al-Qaeda and their affiliates. And we are very careful in terms of how it's been applied. So I think that there's this perception somehow that we're just sending in a whole bunch of strikes willy-nilly. This is a targeted, focused effort.
So for the first time, President Obama actually talking about these strikes, saying not too many people are killed, but it goes a little deeper than this. And I want to take a look at some actual numbers here that the president didn't mention. This is according to a report put together by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. Between 2,000 and 3,000 people have been killed by drones in Pakistan, and of those, as many as 780 are civilians. 175 have been children, and of the 312 drone strikes that have taken place, President Obama has issued 260 of them.
This is beyond just Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's also now into Yemen. They've been using them in Yemen. A lot of civilians have been killed there as well. And it is taking a terrifying toll even on civilians.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
In Yemen, as many as 15 members of a wedding party have reportedly been killed by a drone strike. Officials claim it's likely the civilian group fell victim to the attack after being mistaken for an al-Qaeda convoy. Well, let's go live now to Leah Bolger. She's an anti-drone activist in the States. So, Leah, clearly a tragic mistake. What do you make of this news? Does it surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me. This is just another example in a long list of despicable, illegal, and immoral combat drone strikes on the part of the government of the United States.
At this point in history, virtually every human on this planet is enslaved, whether they know it or not. This is not the crude and primitive slavery of ancient times. It does not rely on whips and shackles to keep the oppressed in their place. These tools have been rendered obsolete by much more sophisticated methods. That most of the enslaved are unaware of their condition and would in fact argue fiercely that they are free is a testament to the effectiveness of these invisible chains. You've heard the expression, money makes the world go round. There's truth in that. Money is the prime motive for human labor in modern civilization. If you want food, shelter, and clothing, you must have money. And unless you're part of that tiny minority that has more money than they could ever spend in their lifetime, then you must work, beg, or steal for that money. That's why you get up in the morning and go to work, even if you hate your job. And that's why the specter of unemployment is more terrifying for most people than the prospect of spending 50 years of their life performing menial tasks within the confines of a fluorescent-lit cubicle. Of course, in Western countries, some are fortunate enough to have pulled away from the brink and do not live in fear that their basic needs will be met, at least for now. And yet they keep spinning the hamster wheel. Why is that? Could it be because money and the bling that it buys have become symbols of status and prestige? Money offers an illusory form of social validation, but even those who are not caught up in distinguishing themselves by how much they accumulate still must acknowledge the social stigma that comes with poverty. The combination of these primal motivators, the need for food, shelter, clothing, and social validation, is a very powerful force. It's enough to drive humans to engage in all forms of activity, even to the point of harming themselves or others in the process. The accumulation of money is therefore an accumulation of social and psychological power, and those who control the creation of money control this power at its source. So who controls the creation of money? Well, in the case of the US dollar, it's not the government. This shouldn't be an earth-shattering revelation. The fact that the Federal Reserve is a private institution owned by a cartel of the world's most powerful banks is quickly becoming common knowledge. Even the mainstream media doesn't deny it at this point. However, the full extent of what this means is only clear when you understand how the banking system really works. And unfortunately, this isn't something we're taught in school. Once you have it explained to you in simple terms, you'll understand why. Every dollar in circulation is loaned into existence by a bank. The process begins with the Federal Reserve when they loan out money to the U.S. government and to other entities. You've probably heard this talked about before, especially in regards to the interest rate on those loans, which the Federal Reserve raises and lowers depending on economic conditions. But what's never talked about in the mainstream is the fact that the Fed isn't actually loaning out money that they have. They are merely typing those dollars into existence on a computer. You may be inclined to believe that this money is based on some physical backing like gold, but you would be mistaken. The Federal Reserve hasn't owned any gold since the 1930s.
The Federal Reserve does not own any gold at all. We have not owned gold since 1934. So we have not engaged in any gold swaps.
When the Federal Reserve loans money to the U.S. government gives the Federal Reserve government bonds in exchange. These bonds are simply written promises to pay back the money that was loaned to them with interest through taxation. So to be clear here, the government is taking out a loan from a bank that's creating that money out of thin air, and they're expecting you, the taxpayer, to cover that loan. The absurdity of this arrangement is even more obvious when you realize that up until 1913, the U.S. government created its own money and had no need for a bank to play the part of a middleman. That new money loaned out by the Federal Reserve enters circulation through the banks, accumulates in the banks, and in the end, the banks end up holding all the cards. Not necessarily for the reasons you may imagine. Contrary to popular belief, the majority of money in circulation isn't actually created by the Federal Reserve, but rather by the ordinary banks that businesses and individuals use for their checking, savings, and mortgages. How is this possible? Well, like the Federal Reserve, ordinary banks are allowed to loan out money that they don't have. There are, of course, restrictions. Banks are only allowed to loan out 10 times the amount of money that they actually have. So if Wells Fargo has $1,000, they can loan you $10,000, and they expect you to pay back that $10,000 plus interest. This is called fractional reserve banking. 75% of all money in circulation is created in this manner. Now, as bad as this may seem, this is really only the tip of the iceberg. Most banks structure payment plans so that for many years, you're paying almost nothing but interest, and only start paying down the principal gradually. The result of this strategy is that in most cases, you pay far more in interest when you purchase a house than the house itself is worth. So here's the real question. If all money is created through loans, where does the money come from to pay for the interest? Let's say we reset the system to zero, loan $1,000 into existence, and charge 7% interest. We now have a total of $1,000 in the system, but we owe $1,000 plus interest, and that's more. The interest ensures that there's always more debt than money in circulation, because the money to pay the interest doesn't exist. Never has, never will. This would be obvious if there was only one loan being issued to one person in this manner, but when performed on a global scale, the reality is hidden. It is transformed into a game of musical chairs where the person ending up without a seat faces bankruptcy and financial ruin. Because every dollar in existence is tied to a debt, this creates an unseen force that draws those dollars back to the banks, kind of like gravity attracts a physical object to Earth. The catch here is that it's the labor of the people that moves that money. Every hour that you work to pay back a loan or to keep the government from throwing you in jail over income taxes is an hour worked for the banks. The total receipts from personal income taxes just barely covers the interest on the national debt. And even the principal for that debt all ends up back in the hands of the banks. And remember, that bank created that money out of nothing. Once you understand that the money that banks loan out isn't actually an asset, but is in fact a piece of legal fiction, it should be clear that you're working for these banks for free. This is a cleverly disguised form of slavery. If you manage to pay your monthly payments, then you are a successful slave, and you are allowed to keep the material comforts that come with that status. But if for some reason you fail to make those monthly payments, then the bank or the IRS comes to take your house, your car, and anything else you have of value. And if somehow, even with this enormous financial advantage, the banks still get themselves into trouble, you, the taxpayer, will be forced to bail them out. No matter what, the banks win. To say the game is rigged is an understatement. You might be inclined to think that if you live outside the United States and you don't use dollars, then this situation has no bearing on your life. But you would be wrong. The dollar is both the world reserve currency and the only currency in which oil is sold on global markets. This is often referred to as the petrodollar status. This means that wherever you live, whether your country is an oil exporter or an oil importer, you are affected. If your country is an oil importer, then you are affected by the fact that in order to keep your country running, you have to acquire dollars. To acquire those dollars, you have to send goods and services to the United States or to someone else who did. Likewise, if your country is an oil exporter, you are affected by the fact that you send your oil to the U.S. in exchange for this debt-based money. You are exchanging something of real and tangible value for digits on a screen. And if for some reason the leadership of your country grows tired of this arrangement and tries to pull off the dollar, you'll quickly find the United States military at your doorstep ready to open up a can of democracy on you. Iraq learned this the hard way when they switched their oil sales to euros in 2000, and Libya when they tried to organize a gold-based currency for Africa. Debt-based money is a masterpiece of social engineering, the ultimate tool of the ruling elite. Yet in reality, the whole thing is nothing more than a construct of belief. Our chains are the chains of the mind, and the path to freedom must also begin in the mind. If we want a better future for our children and grandchildren, then we must work right now to reach a critical mass of awakening. If this is a message you feel the public needs to hear, then be sure to like, favorite, and share this video through as many avenues as possible. If you want more videos like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel, Storm Clouds Gathering, on YouTube. For updates and bonus content, follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/StormCloudsGathering, on Twitter at Collapse Updates, and our website, stormcloudsgathering.com.
A number of years ago, the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, produced a document entitled Modern Money Mechanics. This publication detailed the institutionalized practice of money creation as utilized by the Federal Reserve and the web of global commercial banks it supports. On the opening page, the document states its objective. The purpose of this booklet is to describe the basic process of money creation in a fractional reserve banking system. It then proceeds to describe this fractional reserve process through various banking terminology, a translation of which goes something like this. The United States government decides it needs some money, so it calls up the Federal Reserve and requests, say, $10 billion. The Fed replies, saying, sure, we'll buy $10 billion in government bonds from you. So the government takes some pieces of paper, paints some official-looking designs on them, and calls them treasury bonds. Then it puts a value on these bonds to the sum of $10 billion and sends them over to the Fed. In turn, the people at the Fed draw up a bunch of impressive pieces of paper themselves, only this time calling them Federal Reserve notes, also designating a value of $10 billion to the Fed. The Fed then takes these notes and trades them for the bonds. Once this exchange is complete, the government then takes the $10 billion in Federal Reserve notes and deposits it into a bank account. And upon this deposit, the paper notes officially become legal tender money, adding $10 billion to the U.S. money supply. And there it is. $10 billion in new money has been created. Of course, this example is a generalization, for, in reality, this transaction would occur electronically, with no paper used at all. In fact, only 3% of the U.S. money supply exists in physical currency. The other 97% essentially exists in computers alone. Now, government bonds are, by design, instruments of debt, and when the Fed purchases these bonds, with money it essentially created out of thin air, the government is actually promising to pay back that money to the Fed. In other words, the money was created out of debt. This mind-numbing paradox of how money or value can be created out of debt or a liability will become more clear as we further this exercise. So, the exchange has been made and now $10 billion sits in a commercial bank account. Here's where it gets really interesting. For as based on the fractional reserve practice, that $10 billion deposit instantly becomes part of the bank's reserves, just as all deposits do. And regarding reserve requirements, as stated in modern money mechanics, a bank must maintain legally required reserves equal to a prescribed percentage of its deposits. It then quantifies this by stating, under current regulations, the reserve requirement against most transaction accounts is 10%. This means that with a $10 billion deposit, 10% or $1 billion is held as the required reserve, while the other $9 billion is considered an excessive reserve and can be used as the basis for new loans. Now, it is logical to assume that this $9 billion is literally coming out of the existing $10 billion deposit. However, this is actually not the case. What really happens is that the $9 billion is simply created out of thin air on top of the existing $10 billion deposit. This is how the money supply is expanded. As stated in modern money mechanics, of course they, the banks, do not really pay out loans from the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes, loan contracts, in exchange for credits, money, to the borrower's transaction accounts. In other words, the $9 billion can be created out of nothing simply because there is a demand for such a loan and that there is a $10 billion deposit to satisfy the reserve requirements. Now, let's assume that somebody walks into this bank and borrows the newly available $9 billion. They will then most likely take that money and deposit it into their own bank account. The process then repeats, for that deposit becomes part of the bank's reserves. 10% is isolated, and in turn 90% of the $9 billion, or $8.1 billion, is now available as newly created money for more loans. And, of course, that 8.1 can be loaned out and redeposited, creating an additional 7.2 billion, to 6.5 billion, to 5.9 billion, etc. This deposit money creation loan cycle can technically go on to infinity. The average mathematical result is that about $90 billion can be created on top of the original $10 billion. In other words, for every deposit that ever occurs in the banking system, about 9 times that amount can be created out of thin air.
Money jitters? Ask the obliging Bank of America for a jar of soothing instant money, M-O-N-E-Y, in the form of a convenient personal loan.
So, now that we understand how money is created by this fractional reserve banking system, a logical yet elusive question might come to mind. What is actually giving this newly created money value? The answer? The money that already exists. The new money essentially steals value from the existing money supply. For the total pool of money is being increased irrespective to demand for goods and services. And as supply and demand finds equilibrium, prices rise, diminishing the purchasing power of each individual dollar. This is generally referred to as inflation, and inflation is essentially a hidden tax on the public.
What is the advice that you generally get? And that is, inflate the currency. They don't say debase the currency. They don't say devalue the currency. They don't say cheat the people who are saved. They say lower the interest rates. The real deception is when we distort the value of money. When we create money out of thin air, we have no savings, and yet there's so-called capital. So my question boils down to this: how in the world can we expect to solve the problems of inflation, that is, the increase in the supply of money, with more inflation?
Of course, it can't. The fractional reserve system of monetary expansion is inherently inflationary, for the act of expanding the money supply without there being a proportional expansion of goods and services in the economy will always debase a currency. In fact, a quick glance at the historical values of the US dollar versus the money supply reflects this point definitively, for the inverse relationship is obvious. $1 in 1913 required $21.60 in 2007 to match value. That is a 96% devaluation since the Federal Reserve came into existence. Now, if this reality of inherent and perpetual inflation seems absurd and economically self-defeating, hold that thought, for absurdity is an understatement in regard to how our financial system really operates. For in our financial system, money is debt, and debt is money. Here is a chart of the U.S. money supply from 1950 to 2006. Here is a chart of the U.S. national debt for the same period. How interesting it is that the trends are virtually the same. For the more money there is, the more debt there is. The more debt there is, the more money there is. To put it a different way, every single dollar in your wallet is owed to somebody by somebody. For remember, the only way the money can come into existence is from loans. Therefore, if everyone in the country were able to pay off all debts, including the government, there would not be $1 in circulation. In fact, the last time in American history the national debt was completely paid off was in 1835, after President Andrew Jackson shut down the central bank that preceded the Federal Reserve. In fact, Jackson's entire political platform essentially revolved around his commitment to shut down the central bank, stating at one point, "The bold efforts the present bank has made to control the government are but premonitions of the fate that awaits the American people, should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it." Unfortunately, his message was short-lived, and the international bankers succeeded to install another central bank in 1913, the Federal Reserve. And as long as this institution exists, perpetual debt is guaranteed.
Since last September.
We have not yet reached any conclusions.
Do you know who received that money?
For the, we're in the process right now of doing our review, and
right, but you're the Inspector General. My question to you specifically is, do you know who received that $1 trillion plus that the Fed extended and put on its balance sheet since last September? Do you know the identity of the recipients?
I do not know. We have not looked at that specific area.
To investigate the off-balance sheet transactions conducted by the Federal Reserve, which according to Bloomberg now total $9 trillion in the last 8 months.
I'll have to look specifically at that Bloomberg article. I'm not, I don't know if I have actually seen that particular one.
That's not the point. The question is, have you done any investigation or auditing of off-balance sheet transactions conducted by the Federal Reserve?
At this point, we're conducting our lending facility project at a fairly high level and have not gotten to a specific level of detail to really be in a position to respond to your question.
Have you conducted any investigation or auditing of the losses that the Federal Reserve has experienced on its lending since last September?
We're still in the process of conducting that review. Until we actually, go out and gather the information, I'm not in a position to really respond to the specific question.
To this day, Great Britain collects taxes from the United States via the IRS. The IRS isn't even an agency of the United States government. If you don't believe me, look up IRS publication 6209. The FCC, CIA, FBI, and NASA were never part of the United States government. The U.S. government only holds shares of the stock in various agencies. Social Security numbers are also issued by the UN through the IMF.
There is a big thing that's going to happen in London at this G20, and then they're hiding it, they're camouflaging it, they're not talking about it. Coordination of international regulation. What they are going to do is to put our Fed and our SEC under the control, in effect, of the IMF.
Oh, come on.
They're
You
gonna
believe
take,
they'll do this?
That's what was in the draft agenda. They call it coordination of regulation. What it really is putting the American economy under international regulation. Yeah. And those people who have been yelling, oh, the UN's going to take over global
Conspiracy
government.
theorists.
They've been crazy, but now they're right.
Yeah, well, when Geithner,
It's happening.
When Geithner said he would be open to the idea of a global currency last week, those conspiracy people had said and suggested that for years. Right. You're not wrong. You're not wrong.
And you know, it's what they always do at these conferences is they have the center show is here, and the side show they don't want you to pay attention to. Right. The center show is the size of the stimulus packages. Yeah. The real show is international regulation of the financial institutions, which is going to happen under the IMF control. And remember, the IMF is run by Europeans, the World Bank by Americans.
DickMorris.com. Thanks, Dick. Appreciate it.
There are many people who feel that the solution to the national debt crisis is to cut spending. Others feel that the solution is to raise taxes. And then there's the guys who are actually running this circus who think that the solution is to print more money and to take on more debt. All of these answers are incorrect. These answers are wrong because they're based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the true nature of the dollar. U.S. Federal Reserve notes are based entirely on debt. There are two types of debt that are used to create money. One is through bonds, which the government pledges to pay back at interest by extracting labor from you, the citizenry. And the second method is through fractional reserve banking, which is a practice of loaning out money that doesn't exist and collecting interest. Now, believe it or not, this is legal and standard practice in modern banking. In both cases, the beneficiary of this arrangement is the banks. Now, the system that I'm describing to you is a very cleverly disguised form of slavery. It is, in fact, modern feudalism. However, this is only the tip of the iceberg. The real problem, and the reason that none of the typical solutions to the debt issue that I mentioned earlier will ever work, is the fact that all the debt that is used to create money has interest attached to it. What this means in clear and simple terms is that in our system, debt will always exceed the total amount of money in circulation. It also means that eliminating the debt would extinguish every dollar in circulation that was created through that debt. Take a second to think about what this means. It is mathematically impossible to pay off the debt. Spending less will not fix the problem. Increasing taxes will not fix the problem. The most difficult and the most important thing to come to terms with is that this isn't an accident. The current monetary system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was designed to enslave the population while hiding that slavery to prevent a revolt. It may not be comfortable for us to acknowledge that we've been tricked, that we've been enslaved by men in suits far, far away that we've never met, and that the political solutions that we've come to believe in are meaningless. But that's the cold, hard reality that we need to face.
First built, there was a man born inside who had the ability to change whatever he wanted, to remake the Matrix as he saw fit. It was he who freed the first of us, taught us the truth. As long as the Matrix exists, the human race will never be free.
should come as no surprise that the dollar is everything. The US dollar is the world's major currency. It accounts for approximately 2/3 of all the world's exchange reserves. Half the world's exports are done in dollars. All International Monetary Fund loans are made in dollars. And if you want to buy oil on the international market, the currency is...
The United States intervened secretly in 1973 when OPEC was evaluating this proposal to say, please don't do that. And they were talking to Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and say, why don't you sell these in dollars only? And they're working closely with the British on this. And we will, it's sort of a quid pro quo, we will protect you, we will sell you military arms, we'll keep you in power, as long as you keep selling oil in dollars. Even the CIA didn't know about it at first, neither did Congress. But after the fact, it was a fait accompli, it was done. So ever since then, for the last 31 years, the dollars that OPEC gets flows back to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
That's where the problem lies. Since the agreement with OPEC, the Arab states have been controlling their own oil fields, but have still continued to sell their oil for US dollars. And where do the oil producers bank their dollars? America. It's called the petrodollar cycle.
After the petrodollar recycling system was implemented, 70% of Saudi Arabia's entire wealth was in one account in the Federal Reserve of New York. And that implemented a system where we kept the Saudis in power, they got rich, and we had an unlimited credit card. Japan wants to buy oil, so they make a Honda. They sell us the Honda. We give them that money, dollar bills. They take those dollar bills and they give them over to OPEC. OPEC gives them a barrel of oil. OPEC takes those dollar bills and they give them back to us in the Federal Reserve. So we print the money. It goes to our trade partners. They take some of that money. Some of that money goes to buy their oil, their monthly oil bill. Saudi Arabia then invests it right back in us. That's why it's called petrodollar recycling.
As long as oil is traded in dollars and the US can print them for nothing, then it has its very own money tree. But what happens when the US cannot print those dollars fast enough to keep up with the huge amounts of imports it needs to survive? America is now importing more goods than it can pay for. So by continuing to print more and more dollars, its debt is reaching a dangerous all-time high. Even with petrodollars, it's still having to borrow from former enemies.
That right now you're feeling a bit like Alice. Tumbling down the rabbit hole?
You could say that.
I can see it in your eyes. You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting to wake up. Ironically, this is not far from the truth. Do you believe in fate, Neil?
No.
Why not?
Because I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life.
I know exactly what you mean. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The Matrix.
Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?
That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Why did the United States attack Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen? Why are U.S. operatives helping to destabilize Syria? And why is the United States government so intent on taking down Iran, in spite of the fact that Iran has not attacked any country since 1798? And what's next? What are we headed for? When you look at the current trajectory that we're on, it doesn't make any sense at all if you evaluate it based on what we're taught in school. And it doesn't make any sense if you base your worldview on the propaganda that the mainstream media tries to pass off as news. But it makes perfect sense once you know the real motives of the powers that be. In order to understand those motives, we first have to take a look at history. In 1945, the Bretton Woods Agreement established the dollar as the world reserve currency, which meant that international commodities were priced in dollars. The agreement, which gave the United States a distinct financial advantage, was made under the condition that those dollars would remain redeemable for gold at a consistent rate of $35 per ounce. The United States promised not to print very much money, but this was on the honor system, because the Federal Reserve refused to allow any audits or supervision of its printing presses. In the years leading up to 1970, expenditures in the Vietnam War made it clear to many countries that the U.S. was printing far more money than it had in gold. And in response, they began to ask for their gold back. This, of course, set off a rapid decline in the value of the dollar. The situation climaxed in 1971 when France attempted to withdraw its gold and Nixon refused. On August 15th, he made the following announcement.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
This was obviously not a temporary suspension, as he claimed, but rather a permanent default. And for the rest of the world who had entrusted the United States with their gold, it was outright theft. In 1973, President Nixon asked King Faisal of Saudi Arabia to accept only U.S. dollars as payment for oil and to invest any excess profits in U.S. Treasury bonds, notes, and bills. In return, Nixon offered military protection for Saudi oil fields. The same offer was extended to each of the world's key oil-producing countries, and by 1975, every member of OPEC had agreed to only sell their oil in U.S. dollars. The act of moving the dollar off of gold and tying it to foreign oil instantly forced every oil-importing country in the world to start maintaining a constant supply of Federal Reserve paper. And in order to get that paper, they would have to send real physical goods to America. This was the birth of the petrodollar. Paper went out, everything America needed came in, and the United States got very, very rich as a result. It was the largest financial con in recorded history. The arms race of the Cold War was a game of poker. Military expenditures were the chips, and the U.S. had an endless supply of chips. With the petrodollar under its belt, it was able to raise the stakes higher and higher, outspending every other country on the planet, until eventually U.S. military expenditures surpassed that of all other nations in the world combined. The Soviet Union never had a chance. The collapse of the communist bloc in 1991 removed the last counterbalance to American military might. The United States was now an undisputed superpower with no rival. Many hoped that this would mark the beginning of a new era of peace and stability. Unfortunately, there were those in high places who had other ideas. Within that same year, the U.S. invaded Iraq in the first Gulf War. And after crushing the Iraqi military, and destroying their infrastructure, including water purification plants and hospitals. Crippling sanctions were imposed which prevented that infrastructure from being rebuilt. These sanctions, which were initiated by Bush Sr. and sustained throughout the entire Clinton administration, lasted for over a decade and were estimated to have killed over 500,000 children. The Clinton administration was fully aware of these figures.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And, you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Ms. Albright, what exactly was it that was worth killing 500,000 kids for? In November of 2000, Iraq began selling its oil exclusively in euros. This was a direct attack on the dollar and on U.S. financial dominance, and it wasn't going to be tolerated. In response, the U.S. government, with the assistance of the mainstream media, began to build up a massive propaganda campaign claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and was planning to use them. In 2003, the U.S. invaded, and once they had control of the country, oil sales were immediately switched back to dollars. This is particularly notable due to the fact that switching back to the dollar meant a 15 to 20% loss in revenue due to the euro's higher value. It doesn't make any sense at all unless you take the petrodollar into account.
So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
Let's take a look at the events of the past decade and see if you see a pattern. In Libya, Gaddafi was in the process of organizing a bloc of African countries to create a gold-based currency called the dinar, which they intended to use to replace the dollar in that region. U.S. and NATO forces helped destabilize and topple the Libyan government in 2011, and after taking control of the region, U.S. armed rebels executed Gaddafi in cold blood and immediately set up the Libyan central bank. Iran has been actively campaigning to pull oil sales off of the dollar for some time now, and it has recently secured agreements to begin trading its oil in exchange for gold. In response, the U.S. government, with mainstream media assistance, has been attempting to build international support for military strikes on the pretext of preventing Iran from building a nuclear weapon. In the meantime, they established sanctions which U.S. officials openly admit are aimed at causing a collapse of the Iranian economy. Syria is Iran's closest ally, and they are bound by mutual defense agreements. The country is currently in the process of being destabilized with covert assistance from NATO, and though Russia and China have warned the United States not to get involved, the White House has made statements within the past month indicating that they are considering military intervention. It should be clear that military intervention in Syria and Iran isn't being considered. It's a foregone conclusion, just as it was in Iraq and Libya. The U.S. is actively working to create the context which gives them the diplomatic cover to do what they already have planned. The motive for these invasions and covert actions becomes clear when we look at them in their full context and connect the dots. Those who control the United States understand that even if a few countries begin to sell their oil in another currency, it will set off a chain reaction and the dollar will collapse. They understand that there is absolutely nothing else holding up the value of the dollar at this point, and so does the rest of the world. But rather than accepting the fact that the dollar is nearing the end of its lifespan, the powers that be have made a calculated gambit. They have decided to use the brute force of the U.S. military to crush each and every resistant state in the Middle East and Africa. That in itself would be bad enough, but what you need to understand is that this is not going to end with Iran. China and Russia have stated publicly, and on no uncertain terms, that they will not tolerate an attack on Iran or Syria. Iran is one of their key allies, one of the last independent oil producers in the region, and they understand that if Iran falls, then they will have no way to escape the dollar without going to war. And yet the United States is pushing forward in spite of the warnings. What we are witnessing here is a trajectory that leads straight to the unthinkable. It's a trajectory that was mapped out years ago in full awareness of the human consequences. But who was it that put us on this course? What kind of psychopath is willing to intentionally set off a global conflict that will lead to millions of deaths just to protect the value of a paper currency? It obviously isn't the president. The decision to invade Libya, Syria, and Iran was was made long before Obama had risen to the national spotlight. And yet, he's carrying out his duty just like the puppets that preceded him. So who is it that pulls the strings? Often the best answer to questions like this are found by asking another question. Qui bono? Who benefits? Obviously, those who have the power to print the dollar out of thin air have the most to lose if the dollar were to fall. And since 1913, that power has been held by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a private entity owned by a conglomerate of the most powerful banks in the world. And the men who control those banks are the ones who pull the strings. To them, this is just a game. Your life and the lives of those you love are just pawns on their chessboard. And like a spoiled 4-year-old who tips the board onto the floor when they start to lose, the powers that be are willing to start World War III to keep control of the global financial system. Remember that when these wars extend and accelerate. Remember that when your son or your neighbor's son comes back home in a flag-draped coffin. Remember that when they point the finger at the new boogeyman, because the madmen who are running this show will take this as far as you allow them to. So how much time do we have left? It's a question I hear constantly, but it's the wrong question. Asking how much time we have left is a passive posture. It's the attitude of a prisoner who's waiting to be taken out to a ditch and shot in the back of the head. What are our chances? Can we change course? Also the wrong question. The odds don't matter anymore. If you understand what we're facing, then you have a moral responsibility to do everything in your power to alter the course that we're on, regardless of the odds. It's only when you stop basing your involvement on the chances of success that success actually becomes possible. To strip the ill-begotten power from the financial elites and to bring these criminal cartels to justice will require nothing less than a revolution. The government is not going to save us. The government is completely infiltrated and corrupt to the core. Looking to them for a solution at this point is utterly naive. There are 3 stages of revolution, and they are sequential. Stage 1 is already underway. Stage 1 is the ideological resistance. In this stage, we have to actively work to wake up as many people as possible about what is happening and the direction we're headed. All revolutions originate from a shift in the mindset of the population, and no other meaningful resistance is possible without it. Success in this stage of the game can be measured by the contagion of ideas. When an idea reaches critical mass, it begins to spread on its own and seeps into all levels of society. In order to achieve that contagion, we need more people in this fight. We need more people speaking out, making videos, writing articles, getting this information onto the national and international stage. And we especially need to reach the police and the military. Stage 2 is civil disobedience, also known as nonviolent resistance. In this stage, you put your money where your mouth is, or more accurately, you withhold your money and your obedience from the government, and you do everything in your power to bring the gears of the state to a halt. Practiced in mass, this method alone is often enough to bring a regime to its knees. However, if you fail at this stage, Stage 3 is inevitable. Stage 3 is direct physical resistance. Direct physical resistance is the last resort, and it should be avoided and delayed as long as possible. And it should only be invoked after all other options have been thoroughly exhausted. There are those who talk tough and claim that they will resist when the time comes. But what those people fail to realize is that if you are inactive during the first 2 stages and save your efforts for the last resistance, then you will fail. When the Nazis were moving door to door, dragging people out of their homes in Germany, that was the time to fight back physically. But due to the lack of ideological resistance and civil disobedience leading up to that moment, even an armed uprising would have likely failed at that point. An armed uprising can only succeed if the people have established an attitude of active resistance. And active resistance is only possible after their minds have broken free from the mainstream propaganda. If you want to fight back, it's now or never. You're not going to get another chance, and the stakes are far higher than they were in Nazi Germany.
Now, the world is losing trust in the dollar as a safe haven. A major blow came after Germany's Bundesbank demanded the repatriation of a big chunk of its gold being held in the US because, as Artis Giannichkian reports, some are concerned the assets of foreign nations in the Federal Reserve are not secure or even there.
Behind these walls is one of the most secretive organizations in the world, the U.S. Federal Reserve. Whoever tries to audit them hits a wall. This place is impenetrable for audits. For years, the U.S. Federal Reserve has been the place where many countries have stored a big chunk of their nation's wealth. As the countries weathered different waves of economic crisis, economic instability, the Federal Reserve seems to them like a more or less secure place to keep their funds. But are the funds really secure, or are they even there? There has been speculation for a long time that the Fed doesn't actually have much gold, that it has either sold it off, lent it out, or used it as collateral for borrowings. Either way, there are many claims that the gold that is being stored on behalf of many nations doesn't actually exist. Germany has recently decided to bring home all its gold, but the Federal Reserve said that it's not possible, that it would need until 2020 to be able to accomplish such a transfer. Germany then asked to visit the Fed vaults to make sure that the gold is actually there, but the Fed first refused to permit Germany to examine its own gold. Then the Germans apparently insisted, and the Fed did open only one of 9 rooms, but they were not permitted to either enter or touch the gold. The German government has stored about half of its gold supply with the U.S. Federal Reserve, so they're understandably nervous. This makes not only Germans nervous, of course. U.S. financial institutions have a history of selling things that don't exist. One example, last year Goldman Sachs were proven to have been selling gold certificates to the public, saying that they were backed by real gold in their vaults. But the story leaked out that they, in fact, held no gold at all and were doing so-called fractional reserve gold banking on the basis that few people would want to claim their gold at any one time. And looking further back in history, during World War II, the Fed came to many countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and told them their gold holdings might not be safe because of the war, and that they should permit the Fed to take all of it to the U.S. for safekeeping. Many countries have done that, receiving Fed gold certificates in exchange. But when they later tried to cash in those certificates and reclaim their gold, they were told the certificates were fake, that they contained spelling and other mistakes, so on and so forth. And the Fed still has all that gold. The power of the U.S. Federal Reserve has grown dramatically, especially since the 1970s, when the U.S. cut the link between dollar and gold. That allowed the U.S. dollar to be bought and sold freely on the market, and with the U.S. dollar being the main reserve currency, the U.S. has basically been able to tax the whole world. It can just devalue other countries' holdings by printing more money. Now we see many countries trying to maneuver away from the U.S. dollar as the main reserve currency, and we see many central banks increasing their own gold reserves. And it seems after all these years, the world decided they put too much power in this one building.
Well, the Germans were infuriated when the US Federal Reserve didn't even let them examine their own assets properly. Peter Boehringer, the founder and chairman of the German Precious Metal Association, says that's a bad sign.
We have pressured Bundesbank a lot. We have sent a lot of questions there, and other parties have as well. We have to know why they are not doing a proper audit, why they're not pressuring their partner central banks, especially the Fed, to do a proper audit. Why, if that's not possible for whatever reason, why they're not repatriating their gold. So there's a lot of reasons and questions unanswered. The US or the Fed is nowadays monetizing between 60 and 80% of newly emitted federal debt, federal treasury bonds. There's basically no foreign free market buying for the US dollar treasury debt. And that is bad news. It says something about the quality of the US dollar as a reserve currency. China and India will probably consume 2,300 tons together of gold this year, which is almost 100% of world mining production.
And the Secret of Oz. I want to start by asking a question that will most interest our audience. Is there any gold in Fort Knox? And if not, who took it, why, and how?
No, it was, and incidentally, I detail that in my new book, which is entitled No More National Debt. As far as we know, there's no gold left in Fort Knox. There was one peak into Fort Knox in the 1970s. It was either 1973 or 74. which was instigated by an older friend of mine by the name of Ed Durrell. He spent $11 million of his dollars, he was a very wealthy Ohio industrialist, trying to answer just this question. So they finally opened the doors. They were forced to open the doors in 73 or 74. There were a couple AP reporters, a couple of congressmen, and there's this famous picture of the director of the Mint, Mary Brooks, standing in front of this wall of gold saying, "Look, it's all here." But the problem was they only showed gold vault number 13, which is the smallest of all the gold vaults, and they denied the existence of the central core vault. The AP reporter and photographer on the scene at the time reported that the gold which they showed had a strange orangish hue, and so therefore that means that it had a high copper content. So probably what this was back in the 70s was the remnants of FDR's call-in of gold coins. It was called coin melt. If they had any good deposit gold, which is .995 gold, the only form of gold that's good for international trade, they certainly would have showed a room full of that. My theory is that despite the fact that the U.S. government carries the largest amount of gold on its books, some 248 million ounces, that they probably have zero, except to some of this remnant coin melt.
It certainly does. I do the same thing. And incidentally, on those gold bars, you may have seen there's a German television program called Galileo that just had a program on a refining company in Hanau, which is outside of Frankfurt. And I happen to know Frankfurt quite well. I used to live there. And they discovered a tungsten gold bar which had been covered with gold.
Yeah.
And this proves the story that Rob Kirby brought up about 6 months ago, that he had been told by insiders in China that the Chinese had encountered the same thing in taking delivery of bars from the United Kingdom. So it verifies the story, which I was one of the few people who carried it and said, yes, it's for real, because I believe Rob, because he's a good source,
it was
an honorable person.
It was during the Alan Greenspan years that this took place within the Fed, that they did that, covered with, I think, a 16th of an inch. And working in construction, I understand what that is. A 16th
Very,
inch.
very professionally done.
Yes.
I understand by a rumor that it was probably done during the reign of Bill Clinton and Bush Sr., and the people involved in doing it were Robert Rubin and Larry Summers, among many others.
Wow.
And this is going to be a big scandal, and everybody's going to have to check their bars, and that's why I like coins better.
Forces. Let's go back to World War I now. Now, what got us into World War I? If you asked an historian, they'd give a number of different provocations, the Zimmerman note, but probably the incident that was most inflammatory to the public was the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania was a British passenger ship on its way from New York to England, 1915. At that time, England was at war with Germany, but we had not yet joined World War I. Well, the ship went down, and Americans were told that the Germans simply sank this ship to be ruthless. They saw an innocent passenger ship, wanted to kill a lot of women and children, and so down it went. But that's not why the Germans sank it. They sank it because the Lusitania was loaded from one end to the other with munitions, millions of rounds of ammunition and many other munitions. Everyone who survived that disaster said there were two explosions, a smaller one and then a huge one. The small one was a torpedo hitting. The large one was the munitions detonating. The ship went down in just 18 minutes after a single torpedo hit. By the way, that's confirmed also by the logbook of the sub that sank Lusitania. The U-20's logbook said one torpedo followed by massive explosion. Equally significant, before the tragedy, Winston Churchill, who was then head of the British Admiralty, had ordered a study to be done to determine what the political impact would be if a British passenger ship was sunk with Americans on board. And there were almost 200 Americans on board the Lusitania. And prior to the sinking of the Lusitania, an exchange took place between Sir Edward Grey, the British foreign minister, and Edward Mandell House, who was President Woodrow Wilson's top advisor. Here's the exchange of communications. Gray, what will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board? House's reply, I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into the war. Joseph Kenworthy, who was then in British Naval Intelligence, Commander Kenworthy, said this, the Lusitania was deliberately sent at a considerably reduced speed into an area where a U-boat was known to be waiting and with their escorts withdrawn. What does he say? How can he say a U-boat was known to be waiting? Well, the British in 1915 had cracked Germany's naval codes, and they knew the approximate location of every U-boat at that time in the British Isles. They also knew the location of the U-boat, the U-20, by reports of its recent activities. Now, in the United States, an official hearing, investigation was carried into looking into the sinking of Lusitania, but at that hearing, officials were only allowed to see a dummy manifest that omitted the ship's munitions. The original manifest that listed the munitions was ordered by President Woodrow Wilson to be hidden in the archives of the U.S. Treasury. Now, hearing this, some of you might think, well, Mr. Perloff, isn't that just sort of a conspiracy theory? Is that pretty wild stuff? Actually, almost everything I just said has already been on the History Channel. In the documentary In Search of the Lusitania, you can read about it in the book The Lusitania by British historian Colin Simpson, or in Room 40, which came out more recently by Patrick Beasley. Now, Beasley is a former officer in British Naval Intelligence, and he's considered the world's leading authority on the history of British naval intelligence. Here's what he writes in his book. I am reluctantly driven to the conclusion that there was a conspiracy, his words, to put the Lusitania at risk in the hopes that even an abortive attack on her would bring the United States into the war.
Maybe they've always been with us. Those things out there. Maybe they love it. Seeing us hate each other. Watching us kill each other off.
Remember the Maine? No, seriously, do you remember the Maine? The phrase refers to that massive explosion that sank one of America's first battleships, stationed in Havana, Cuba, killing 260 U.S. sailors on board. Today marks the 115th anniversary of that event. At the time, the Navy officially stated that the ship was blown up by a mine. And while they didn't place the blame directly on Spain, Congress left little doubt that the Spanish were in fact responsible for the explosion. The sinking of the Maine, coupled with U.S. criticism of Spain's control over Cuba, were all the ingredients necessary to start the Spanish-American War. The war lasted only a few months, ending with a ceasefire in the Treaty of Paris. However, an overlooked aspect of this treaty is that it officially granted the U.S. government its first overseas empire, having acquired the territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, formerly in the possession of Spain. But if we want to truly give justice to the memory of the Maine, we should consider all the facts. See, in 1976, American naval investigators concluded that the inferno that sank the Maine and killed more than half its crew was caused by the ship's ammunition stockpile igniting. The investigation proved once and for all that the Spanish were not to blame. Isn't it interesting that an entire war could be launched against another country based entirely on false pretenses? Well, we're no strangers to this notion of starting wars on lies. One just has to look at the Iraq War to see that this is a common occurrence. But did you know that there's actually a long history of governments staging events or provocations and blaming them entirely on other countries in order to provide a pretext for war? They're called false flag attacks. And according to its naval warfare origins, a false flag attack occurs when a government uses an elite special operations cadre to attack that nation state while falsely bearing the flag of another country or group. In other words, it's a self-inflicted wound used to outrage the populace and provide the necessary support and motivation for a country to attack or declare war. And in fact, falsehoods seem to be at the heart of every major war of aggression throughout history. But I'll just go over a few more. Remember how the U.S. became embroiled in the Vietnam War? Well, in 1964, President Johnson reported that 3 Vietnamese boats attacked 2 U.S. warships in the Gulf of Tonkin off the Vietnamese coast. Newspapers, including the Washington Post and New York Times, among countless other publications, ran headlines about the attack which helped to galvanize the public to support the U.S. to enter the war. I don't blame the public for supporting retaliation against a country attacking their own. However, there's one slight problem with the story. It simply is false. Literally, it never happened. It was a made-up event, which took decades to come to light. A false flag event might be a foreign notion to you. You might be grappling with the fact that this country would kill its own citizens to advance an agenda. But one has to look no further than what former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara under JFK proposed under a now declassified document known as Operation Northwoods. Northwoods is probably one of the most sinister plans ever devised, at least that we know of. And it was aimed at developing a way to trick the American public and the international community into supporting a war for Cuba. Based on the document, it was revealed that the U.S. forces would be authorized to use, quote, pretexts which would provide justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. The most alarming aspect of this was the disturbing scope to which these pretexts entailed. See for yourself. They included starting rumors, using clandestine radio, landing friendly Cubans in uniform over the fence to stage attacks on base, capturing Cuban saboteurs inside the base, starting riots, blowing up ammunition, starting fires, burning aircrafts, lobbing mortar shells, capturing militia groups, sabotaging and sinking ships, and conducting mock funerals for mock victims. The extent of this false flag proposition even went as far as to hijack American aircrafts and blow up a NASA rocket carrying an astronaut. Luckily, Kennedy had enough sense to reject the plan. But what if other presidents aren't like Kennedy? You know, many people look at the events of 9/11 in that same light, and I myself still have many questions about the attacks, seen as how they were used to create perpetual war abroad and a police state here at home. Do you think Bush and Cheney had Kennedy's sense? Do you think Obama does?
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall we had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition of, you know, it's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." And by that time, we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, oh, it's worse than that. This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
World War II. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, triggering our entry into that war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared the attack was a day that will live in infamy. A day of infamy indeed, but not because of the alleged surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. After 60 years of surfacing information, it is clear that not only was the attack on Pearl Harbor known weeks in advance, it was outright wanted and provoked. Roosevelt, whose family had been New York bankers since the 18th century, whose uncle Frederick was on the original Federal Reserve Board, was very sympathetic to the interests of the international bankers, and the interest was to enter the war, as we've seen, nothing is more profitable for international bankers than war. In a journal entry by Roosevelt's Secretary of War Henry Stimson, dated November 25, 1941, he documented a conversation he had with Roosevelt. The question was, how should we maneuver them into firing the first shot? It was desirable to make sure the Japanese be the ones to do this, so that there should remain no doubt as to who were the aggressors. In the months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had done almost everything in his power to anger the Japanese, showing a posture of aggression. He halted all of Japan's imports of American petroleum. He froze all the Japanese assets in the United States. He made public loans to nationalist China and supplied military aid to the British, both enemies of Japan in the war, which, by the way, is completely in violation of international war rules. And on December 4th, 3 days before the attack, Australian intelligence told Roosevelt about a Japanese task force moving towards Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt ignored it. So, as hoped and allowed, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, killing 2,400 soldiers. Before Pearl Harbor, 83% of the American public wanted nothing to do with the war. After Pearl Harbor, 1 million men volunteered for the war. It is important to note, Nazi Germany's war effort was largely supported by 2 organizations, one of which was called IG Farben. IG Farben produced 84% of Germany's explosives, and even the Zyklon B used in the concentration camps to kill millions. One of the unspoken partners of IG Farben was J.D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company in America. In fact, the German Air Force could not operate without a special additive patented by Rockefeller's Standard Oil. The drastic bombing of London by Nazi Germany, for example, was made possible by a $20 million sale of fuel to IG Farben by the Rockefeller Standard Oil Company. This is just one small point on the topic of how American business funded both sides of World War II. One other treasonous organization worth mentioning is the Union Banking Corporation of New York City. Not only did it finance numerous aspects of Hitler's rise to power, along with actual materials during the war, it was also a Nazi money laundering bank, which was eventually exposed for having millions of dollars of Nazi money in its vaults. The Union Banking Corporation of New York was eventually seized for violations of the Trading with the Enemy Act. Guess who the director and vice president of the Union Bank was? Prescott Bush, our current president's grandfather, and of course our former president's father. Keep that in mind when considering the moral and political dispositions of the Bush family.
LBJ wanted a real war, but the resolution he had put to Congress had been shelved.
What I want is somebody that can lay out some plans to trap these guys and whip hell out of them. Kill some of them. That's what I want to do.
I'll try and bring something practical, meet that objective.
After what he called an unprovoked attack, he got his resolution.
Congressional leaders of both parties supported the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. In fact, only 2 members of Congress voted against the resolution, Senators Morse of Oregon and Greening of Alaska.
Being in the minority never proves that you're wrong. In fact, history is going to record that Senator Greening and I voted in the interest of the American people this morning when we voted against this resolution. And I'd have the American people remember what this resolution really is. It's a resolution which seeks to give the President of the United States the power to make war without a declaration of war.
The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was not a declaration of war. There never was a declaration of war in Vietnam, but it served much the same purpose. The President was given broad powers to wage war. But what the Congress did not know, what the country did not know, is that the second attack in the Gulf of Tonkin may never have happened.
We now know beyond any reasonable doubt that it did not happen.
If one... Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me.
This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you, good night, and God bless America.
Impact segment tonight, an outrageous situation concerning criminal aliens who are convicted of violent crimes here in the USA. Thousands of them were released by the feds last year and are running around the country right now. The Center for Immigration Studies reports that 193 convicted killers were let go, 426 convicted sex offenders, 303 kidnappers, and more than 1,000 criminals convicted of aggravated assault.
There's a battle. Arizona fighting back yet again after being flooded by illegal immigrants, many of them children, brought over from Texas on buses and planes by American federal agents, allegedly on orders from the White House.
A Long Island filmmaker recently produced a documentary which focuses on illegal immigration and its impact on this country. It's called They Come to America. Is this a protest film?
Absolutely not. It's a Wake Up America film.
The builders that used to hire me and my guys come up here to get the cheap labor, and they cut me right out of the picture. Right. Now my tax-paying American citizens aren't paying the bills anymore. Who's paying the bills? These guys? They get their checks and they send it back home.
Is the biggest problem this country has in the years to come.
Look around you. The people of the United States are not able to achieve the quality of life they want with 300 million people.
What do you say to the people who say, open our arms, open our doors, welcome them here?
We open our arms more than any other nation. The problem is we have 20 million Americans that are out of work. We have schools closing. Why?
You're very emotional right now.
I went to school. So easy to get into this country.
What you're looking at right over there, those white buildings, it is a cartel headquarters for distribution of drugs in this area. I'll tell you, you go near there, you're dead. You're dead.
From the Texas border, authorities are very concerned. They're on their way here to the U.S. You probably think these guys are on their way here, right?
Oh, they're going to come to vote, and then they'll get a work permit, if Obama has his way. Nobody in America understands what's going on along that border, from Texas all the way to California, except for the ranchers and the Border Patrol agents. I went down there and spent 3 days in the dirt, Neil. It's unbelievable. We have people crossing our borders. We don't know who they are or why they're coming here. That is a problem, and if it does not change, September 11th will happen again.
On May 10, 2013, Wired magazine released an article pointing out provisions for a biometric system for all Americans hidden in the new proposed immigration bill, the Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act. Now, the assertions in this piece were quickly dismissed in an article by the Daily Beast, and based on that article and a superficial reading of the law in question, you might be put at ease and agree that these claims were in fact exaggerated. However, in this video, we're going to demonstrate that not only are the accusations of a unified biometrics database system tied to employment accurate, but that in fact the reality is far more serious than Wired magazine contended. In order to understand why this is the case, we have to read the fine print of the law very carefully and look at a number of other federal programs that are developing in tandem. All of the links to the articles and documents in question will be provided in the description below. Now first, let's just take a look at the actual wording of the bill. The controversy starts on page 178, where it mandates the creation of a, quote, photo tool, which would in fact be a federal database administered by the Department of Homeland Security, containing names, ages, social security numbers, and photographs of everyone in the country with a driver's license or other state-issued ID. The law would require employers to check potential employees in this database and match their photographs and pertinent documents before hiring them. Now, the Daily Beast is correct here when they say that a single photograph isn't really a full biometric set. However, on page 194 of the document, it clearly authorizes the government to confirm the identity and employment authorization through verification and comparison of records as determined necessary by the Secretary. This is further confirmed on page 225, which calls for the, quote, connectivity between U.S. citizenship and immigration services and U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the Department of Justice, and other agencies or officials with respect to sharing of information to support such systems and related to immigration enforcement actions. The operative terms here are the undefined other agencies and officials. This is open-ended and unrestricted, and that means that records will be merged with and shared with other federal databases at the discretion of the DHS. How is this relevant to biometrics? Well, let's take a look at the FBI's own website, where they talk about their new biometrics database called the Next Generation Identification, or NGI. NGI is a system designed to collect biometric information from any and all available sources, and includes face recognition, voice recognition, and iris scan information, and more. According to the FBI, this program was 60% complete in 2012 and is on schedule to be fully operational in the summer of 2014. The new immigration bill clearly allows for these two databases to be directly connected. Furthermore, on page 190 of the immigration bill, under Section H, it grants the government the authority to modify information requirements at their discretion, meaning that once the system is in place, they can incrementally increase the amount of biometric data required for identification cards to be accepted. To make matters worse, we already know that the federal government has begun collecting biometric information covertly at security checkpoints. We've also seen this come up at Occupy protests, where protesters were given higher bail if they refused iris scans. And this is just what's been leaked to the public. The reality is that you are being photographed and filmed more and more, and technology is making it easier and easier to unify this information and tie it to your identity. Once the unified biometric database system is established and is tied to employment, personal information data can be easily filled in over time, using sources like surveillance cameras, social networks, or medical records. Medical records, you ask? How is the government going to access those? Well, through Obamacare. This isn't a conspiracy theory. Obama's healthcare bill clearly establishes an electronic medical record system to hold all medical records on a national level, in which the federal government will have access to. This is justified to reduce paperwork and make the system more efficient. Connect all the dots here, and it's clear that the immigration bill is a Trojan horse. It creates a national identification system tied to any federal agency the government chooses, referencing any information that the government chooses, biometrics included, and it makes this a condition of your employment, and therefore impossible to avoid for most people. Furthermore, this system is explicitly designed to expand from the get-go, so to expect it not to is beyond naive. Why is this dangerous? Well, in order to understand that, you have to look at the current state of biometric technology. There have been many people over the years concerned about the possibility of being chipped by the government, and that these chips would be used to track people. However, current biometric technology makes embedding microchips irrelevant. We already have systems in place which can identify a person from a distance just by the rhythm of their walk. Not to mention facial and voice recognition software that has become more and more advanced over the years. Even Facebook is able to identify individuals in photos that you've uploaded. And the NYPD has publicly acknowledged that they're using Facebook's facial recognition database in criminal investigations. That means that the government has access to pictures of you from as many angles as have been uploaded to the internet. Here's what you need to realize. The totalitarian control grid that's being set up right now isn't being established in one monolithic piece of legislation. It's being established in fragments that are converging to form something much larger. If you wait until this unified picture is obvious to everyone, it'll be too late. This unified identification system isn't going to stop with employment or healthcare. Just like all government programs, it will be gradually expanded into travel, taxes, banking, and even internet access if they can get away with it. This isn't about immigration. It's about power. If you want people to hear this message, be sure to click the like button, add it to your favorites, and share it through as many avenues as possible. If you want more videos like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel, Stormclouds Gathering, on YouTube. For updates and bonus content, follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/StormcloudsGathering, on Twitter at Collapse Updates, and our website, stormcloudsgathering.com.
of peace, inside the state, war is created, no man's land will be alive.